Chapter 7. Scrit. The lights of Fortinbras twinkled below Sabrina as the rocky ground of Hill 36 crunched underfoot. An ocean breeze bent the stems of a patch of hyssop, scattering the minty scent of their leaves. Her side of the hill was empty. The sentry lights slumbered, as the only movement around them was the occasional field mouse or bat swooping low to catch a meal. Sabrina sat down, her hands resting on her knees, and cycled through a series of menus displayed on her visor, flipping through them with quick snapping motions of her wrist. It was against protocol while on duty, but she clicked into the station's database to see how cases had been assigned. She found what she wanted, closed all the menus, and called Lindsay.
"Slow night on the hill?"
"Like you wouldn't believe."
"No scrits?"
"Not a single one. Wouldn't mind the target practice."
"Stop it. I always feel so sorry for them. Are their brains really wasted?"
"They usually have no short-term memory. No one knows what the occultists do to them to make them that way. The one thing they do remember is that they want to find some piece of the old temple." The line was quiet. "Lindsay, you there?"
"Yeah, just thinking about the scrits. It's sad. If Dag really wanted to put a stop to it, he could just pave over the whole hill."
"He'd like to, but we don't have the materials. Although Moshi is working overtime on some new toys to pull apart the old buildings along the Bay Road."
"How is Moshi?"
"More forgetful than ever. I worry about him. Gets worse every year." Lindsay yawned loudly in her ear. Sabrina could hear the rustle of covers.
"Do you have any cheery news, or are you going to try to keep me awake with depressing things?"
"I checked the station records."
"Depressing things, then. You trying to torture yourself?"
"The Orhem case is gone from the records. Wiped clean, like he never existed," Sabrina said, flinging a rock down the hillside.
"The T-heads have it now. Even a civilian like me knows that."
"Of course they do. But there is a case at the hospital. Enough equipment for an entire OR was stolen from a loading dock. That should go to Sean and me. We're next in line for assignment. Instead, it's listed as unassigned."
"Didn't you say half of the cases never get solved anyway?"
Lindsay said through another yawn. "Yeah, but who can really find out who stole Miss Randashan's handbag? Who cares? She probably just forgot it somewhere. But the hospital, that is a crime that affects hundreds of people."
"Was anyone hurt in the attempt?"
"One security guard. He's still in a coma. If he doesn't wake up, a murder charge will be added. Then it might get some attention."
"Here's hoping for murder, then,"
Lindsay chirped. Sabrina laughed. "No, I hope he is fine. I might put my uncle in a coma if he keeps this up, though."
"All the more reason to go to Lysander for school."
"I'm sure you will get into Lysander arts, but my grades stink. Every time I try to study, I just think I would rather be outside running."
"Can you read on duty there?"
"Then I'd really fall asleep. Not even allowed to talk to you."
"I'm calling the police."
Sabrina's laughter was cut short by a red flash in her vision. "I gotta go. The sensors are picking something up below. Probably just a deer, but I need to investigate."
"Go to it. I'm going back to sleep."
Sabrina flipped to a map of the hill. Green dots represented the other cadets. They were clustered in twos, something they often did at this time of night. One slept under a tree or in a strand of bushes, while the other kept lookout, less for scrits than for supervisors who might be dropping in for a surprise visit. She was alone, her dot isolated by wide gaps of blackness. She heard a mechanical whine from higher up the hill, an all-terrain robot with built-in floodlights and additional weaponry. It tracked her motions as she moved, the only partner willing to work with her. A second sensor flashed on her screen. Something below was coming toward her. She decided to radio in her position to the other cadets. "Noted," an apathetic voice replied without identifying himself or offering any backup. None of the dots on the far side of the mountain budged.
"Is it because I'm a woman?"
she had once asked Sean. Her yearning for his company manifested as a pang in her chest as she ducked beneath the branches of a fig tree. "Half right," he had said. 'Cause you're a woman who's a better shot, a better fighter, and a better officer than all of them." She smiled at the memory and moved with greater determination toward her target. A third sensor tripped, this one much closer. She dialed the all-terrain's controls to stop and deactivated its lights. She was in a thicket of tamarisk trees, their low-hanging branches obscuring her vision. She moved her fingers to activate the infrared spectrum on her visor, fully expecting to see the outline of a deer. But as soon as she did, she was blinded by a flood of yellow while alarms screamed in her ears. She snapped up the visor. Lights positioned in the trees had activated, bringing daylight to the patch of hillside. The green hues of the trees reappeared, branches whipped and snapped as a figure rushed out of the thicket and up the hill. His hair was a bush, his sandals worn so much that his cracked heels poked through the soles. His clothes were ripped and ragged, flapping as he ran. Beneath the rags, visible through the gaps and tears, glistened skin that was shadowed with the distinct markings of a scrit. He had been startled like a wild animal by the lights. Exposed now, and entering the open, he made a straight path for the hilltop. Sabrina slapped the call button on her communicator. "Cadet Sabrina, reporting a perimeter breach." The words would automatically send her position to the other cadets. The all-terrain responded and spun its wheels to intercept the intruder. Her legs burned as she followed him up the slope. She was close enough to clearly see the writing that covered his body. Flowing script was tattooed over every inch from his neckline to his toes. She could even see the writing on his hands as he reached down in a graceful, balanced motion, picked up a large stick, and swung it at the approaching all-terrain. Its light and camera shattered. The mechanical arm that had been probing outward to stun him went wide. A chorus of distress alarms sounded from the machine as it wheeled wildly, skidded in the loose gravel, then tumbled end over end down the hill. So much for my partner. A second bank of lights activated and poured light down on the barren stretch of open space between the intruder and the last fence. The foundation of the temple waited in the shadows beyond, wind tossing the heads of the weeds and grasses that grew from the cracks in the stone. Sabrina drew the stun rifle off her back and took aim. "Stop, or I will shoot!" Scrits were to be apprehended, but never harmed. Direct orders from her uncle himself. The intruder did not respond or slacken his pace. She charged the rifle, placed the crosshairs on him, and fired. The cylinder came spinning out with a buzz as its rear blades whirred through the air to stabilize. It struck the scrit in the torso, latching onto his clothes with mandibles. Immediately, a blue arc of electric energy crackled in the air and dissipated. Sabrina swore. His clothes were hanging too loosely that the cylinder had fired its charge from too far away. Now she was left looking at a cloud of dust as he moved out of range of the rifle. He was above her, and that would not look good on a report. She sprinted after him as he approached another light that activated. She fired 2 more shots. One missed, and the other discharged from a flap of his trousers. Some of the charge slowed him, causing him to limp as the muscles in his legs seized, but he showed astonishing strength and pushed onward. A third bank of lights activated. Sabrina threw the rifle aside and drew a weighted snare from her belt. When she was close enough, she spun it in a circle past her ear 3 times, then released. The snare caught him in mid-stride, and he slammed to the ground with a gasp, the air knocked from his lungs. He was just a boy, a few years younger than Sabrina, his face youthful, not unlike many of her friends from school. He had a strong jaw with a glinting of gold whiskers running along it. His eyes were a mesmerizing blue, like the sky on a cloudless day. For an instant, he dug in the dirt like a dog looking for bones, but then came to his senses, looking again at the fence ahead, and back at Sabrina. She had her blaster out, set on stun. He reached to his belt and began to saw at the bindings on his leg with a knife. "Drop the knife!" It was too late. He had already cut the bindings and leapt upwards in a swirl of clothes and muscle. The fighter in her had already assessed his strength and agility. He was strong, fast, and coordinated. But, like most scrits, he was rash and dumb. More animal than human. Nonetheless, he would be dangerous to try and subdue by hand. "Drop the knife or I'll shoot!" His feet were set in a wide stance. His eyes darted back and forth between her and his objective at the peak of the hill. The knife hovered in the air between them. She could read his intent as easily as she could read an opponent in the ring. She fired. He convulsed and fell backwards, but he rolled to his feet again and limped for the fence. A second stun after 2 partial shocks from the rifle might be too much for his system. All she needed now was a dead scrit on her record. She jogged after him. The knife was still in his right hand, while his left covered the place where she had shot him. He was no longer even running. Instead, he drew himself forward on one leg, dragging the other behind him. She approached him from an angle just as the last bank of lights activated, and she swept his legs out from beneath him with her foot. He dropped and rolled onto his back, still brandishing the knife. Her nostrils filled with the scent of his sweat and the musty smell of the desert that all Scrits carried on them. She let him stagger to his feet again. Blood trickled from his forehead. His expression was dazed, his eyes beginning to water. His breath was ragged as he gasped through his lips, one of which was split and bleeding. Sabrina knew she could likely disarm him, but it was too late. He was fleeing again, his flight reduced to a pathetic limping walk, and finally a crawl. She pulled her microphone down close to her mouth. "Charge the fence!" She knew officers kept score between cadets and Scrits. A Scrit netted before the last fence was a point for the cadet. If they reached the fence, it was a point for the Scrits. Her class had had a perfect score. Until now. The Scrit stumbled the last few steps, still clutching his abdomen. He would be sore there for days. He leapt onto the fence. The mesh was already charged, and he shuddered as he came into contact with it. It was a lower charge than a stun from her blaster, and therefore safer. Sabrina walked up behind him, waiting for the initial tremors to subside, his limbs sending up clouds of dust as spasms racked his body. He was still clutching the knife, but it was not hard to pin his arm behind his back, lock his elbow, and force his grip to relax. The knife fell. He swung at her with his free hand. It was comical and wide, but angered something inside of her. She let her reflexes take control before she could think better of it, pivoting on her foot and using his momentum to swing him back into the fence. The charge was gone now, but the impact still took him unawares. His arm was firmly in her grasp. He did not realize yet that this fight was over, that he was a puppet on a string. He kicked at her. This resistance angered her even more, and the rhythm of combat took over. She delivered a punch to his lower back. Before his cry of pain ended, she turned on the ball of her foot and let fly a kick into the back of his knee. He dropped. His eyes skittered from one side to the other. His resistance was gone. She punched him anyway, taking pleasure in the way her fist landed squarely on his cheek. She punched him again on his opposite temple, and then in the center of his face, snapping his head backwards. When the other cadets appeared, he was coughing on, blood pouring from his nose. "He resisted," she said as one of her classmates neared. 5 more brought up the rear, their weapons raised, the carbon mesh and flex bands of their patrol suit glinting in the moonlight. Their visors were down over their eyes. The quiet dark of the night was ruptured by a jet that sounded like a child's scream. The gravel underfoot, the electric fences, the other cadets, and the Scrit were all cast in an eerie pale glow as an Elved's dark bulk rose from a crest in the hill. The twin blue cones of flame from its turbines roared and crackled as the nozzles redirected the thrust. Tamarisk trees that had been waving gently in the breeze going out to sea whipped and shook violently, leaves exploding outward as the machine passed over. Sabrina had not known it had been lurking so close. By the looks on the other cadets' faces, neither had they. The gold-ringed black dot that usually identified the machines on the survey maps had failed to appear. The Elved passed overhead, throwing up a backwash of dust and dried needles from the trees, and filling the air with the acrid smell of methylene. Sabrina was careful not to be too distracted, and kept a hand on the shoulder of her Scrit. He had begun to tremble violently, his skin covered in a cold sweat. The other cadets strained their necks to watch the machine overhead, the reflection of the lights on its shoulders and chest gliding across their visors. Sabrina noticed the machine's head swivel, taking in the entire scene. Did it linger on her and the Scrit? She could not tell before the machine banked and disappeared behind the shoulder of the ridge. Cricket chirps returned. The gentle night breeze whispered in the trees. Sabrina could hear surf crashing down at the bottom of the hill. The cadets fell back into their roles, each demonstrating a sudden, earnest adherence to protocol, as if an instructor had appeared unexpectedly on the scene. Sabrina could not help rolling her eyes. She turned the Scrit over, slapped bindings on his wrists, and jerked him upright. The cadet stepped aside as she led him past. Unsteady and dazed, he nearly fell, Sabrina catching him on his salt-encrusted robe. One of the cadets slipped and fell on some of the scree underfoot, trying to make way for them. "All clear," she said, stepping past without offering a hand. Cruisers were parked in a valley between hills 36 and 34. Sabrina pushed her prisoner into the back of one and set off for the station. The Scrit had recovered and was keening, throwing his shoulders up against the sides of the vehicle. She glared at the switch that would seal the rear of the cruiser and infuse it with a gas that would sedate him. She did not trust the seals. Other officers complained of feeling groggy for hours after gassing prisoners. "Quit it!" she yelled, punching the mesh grill, shaking it loudly in its fasteners. Her violence stunned him. He stopped, his face lost in the shadows, his head down. Sabrina breathed a sigh of relief and turned her eyes forward to the road when the message screen on the dash blinked. "Can mercy be found in the heart of she who was born of the stone? She the origin and the devourest of all things. She the mother without mercy." Sabrina slowed the cruiser and pulled off to the side of the road. She stared at the readout. The words remained, unblinking. With the cruiser stopped, she could hear the screech of an owl, the hiss of the surf just over the guardrail. Did she also hear the faint whine of an Elved? If so, the machine was distant and pulling away. She imagined moonlight glinting silver on its wings. The sky overhead was clear, full of stars. She turned back to the dashboard message screen. "Coastal Highway, north by northwest, post 8, 23 minutes to HQ." She rubbed her eyes. "What did I just see? Will you help me?" The Scrit had pressed his face to the mesh between the front seat and back. In the soft amber glow of the streetlights, he was handsome. She thought it a shame that his mind was so ruined. She checked the dashboard message once more. It no longer seemed to be malfunctioning. With a check of her mirrors, she moved the cruiser back onto the road. On impulse, she asked, "What is your name?" "Seeker." This is new, Sabrina thought. "Where are you from, Seeker?" she said, discreetly flicking on the voice recorder. I'm not supposed to tell you." "Oh, it's all right. I'm here to help you." You are one of the Nazarene. I'm not supposed to speak to you," he said, turning over his hands. "I am here to seek." "Seek what?" He said nothing. They drove on for a little longer, and she noticed him looking alarmed. Already his memory had reset. Like all Scrits, he could not retain more than a few minutes of memories. "Where am I?" "You are safe. I'm here to help you," she said. "What is your name?" He looked around the back seat as if noticing it for the first time. He grimaced, and his eyes alighted on his hands. Sabrina noticed him studying them, reading them. "I am Seeker." "Where are you from, Seeker?" I'm not supposed to tell you." Sabrina sighed and checked the time left before she reached headquarters. Less than 15 minutes. The young man grimaced and shook his hands, flexing and unflexing them. "Do your hands hurt?" He nodded. She pulled the car over to the side of the road again. On a hunch, she reached across the seat and opened the med kit. She shook a can of Stera-spray, then opened a latch on the mesh barrier between them. He recoiled. "Just put your hands through. I promise it will help." She sprayed her own hand first. Only then did he slowly squeeze through both bound hands. She sprayed. The shadows mixed seamlessly with the dark markings on his skin. His palms, where he had fallen, were cut in several places. When she finished, he retracted his hands. "Better?" she asked. He nodded. She turned back to the wheel. "Please help me. I'm scared. I can't remember anything." He reached up to touch his head and gasped when he found blood on his hands. She knew her foot should simply press the accelerator, but instead she watched as a hand, her hand, turned off the voice recorder. For a moment they both sat in silence. She tried to focus her mind on a question to ask him, but those gibberish words from the dashboard were seared in her mind. Can mercy be found in the heart of she who was born of the stone? She could feel his eyes on her while she stared out the windscreen. A civilian roll pod passed, going in the opposite direction, its headlights sending a spiny mouse on the shoulder capering into the bushes. I'm Sabrina. What is your name?
Jacob.
Her heart began to beat in her ears. She fought the urge to turn the recorder back on, afraid he would notice and stop cooperating. Where are you from, Jacob? She slowly turned in her seat. He seemed to think hard, as if trying to recall a faded memory.
The desert.
Where in the desert?
I can't remember.
Don't look down. Look at me. When you think of the desert, whom do you see?
A woman. My mother. She fled there with the others.
What others?
Others who were fleeing.
What were they fleeing from? Was it war?
Something like that. But something worse. I can't remember.
He rocked forward and struck his head with the heels of his hand. No, Jacob, you are doing so well. Who else was in the desert? She said. She wanted to put a hand on his shoulder to soothe his agitation, but the best she could do was place her hand against the screen between them. His eyes focused on it a moment. He tilted his hand to the side, and his expression changed, as if he was looking on another scene playing before him.
There were people there already. They were once our enemies, but what is on my hands?
Just some ink, Jacob. It will come off. Tell me about those people who were your enemies.
They were darker. I was afraid of them, but they helped us.
Why are they out in the desert?
To be safe from the rays.
The sun's rays? The desert does not seem to be a good place to avoid the sun's rays.
No, something worse. Something in the city.
He flexed his wrists against his bindings, the muscles in his arms rock hard, his foot kicking the screen.
I can't remember.
You are doing great, Jacob. What was in the city?
I can't remember. What am I doing here?
He began to look back and forth, pressing his hands against the windows. Jacob, tell me more about what you remember about the desert. How do you survive?
In caves near springs. And the Watchers, they watch over us.
Who are the Watchers?
The ones from above. Sometimes they come down. I remember when there was a sickness, and they came down to heal us. But others threw rocks at them, especially the old.
He was making no sense to her any longer. She decided to change her line of questioning. Jacob, why did you come here?
Because God is here.
The interior of the cruiser felt like it was suddenly shrinking from the weight of the night outside. Sabrina felt a shiver travel up from deep inside her gut to her shoulders, neck, even scalp. Don't say that word, Jacob. Don't ever say that word. His breaths came rapidly, and he threw himself to the far side of the seat, away from her.
You are one of them. Oh, no, let me go.
He began to flail and kick at the sides of the cruiser. The vehicle rocked back and forth with his motions. Sabrina started the cruiser again. Eventually he exhausted himself, then seemed to forget why he was panicked. He looked around as if waking up.
Where am I?
Sabrina checked the navigation screen. 8 minutes to the station. I'm here to help, she said, but could not conceal the exasperation in her voice this 4th time around. He was reading his hands again. Jacob, she said. He looked up for a moment at the sound of the name. A smile crossed his lips, then faded and was replaced by a scowl. What is on the mountain?
My name is Seeker.